When I started writing the script for this video, I initially wanted to do a video where I explore the different theories surrounding Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, and specifically looking at whether this game would be a prequel or a sequel. But as I was writing the script, the more I was researching both positions and coming up with arguments and reading Reddit threads and having 40 different wiki tabs open and reading through a document one of my viewers, Chipino, made specifically for this video, I was starting to go a little crazy. I was starting to feel, and I think starting to look like Charlie in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, in that one very famous conspiracy theory scene that's become a huge meme. It wasn't pretty at all. So I did the same thing. I decided to step away from the computer, touch a little bit of grass, and come back to it the next day. And what I ended up finding were the raving of a lunatic. A little deflated in the face of what now seemed like a wasted day of scripting and researching, I was ready to abandon the video's concept entirely. But that's when I got an idea. Instead of driving myself crazier than I already am by trying to salvage the script, wouldn't it be better if I asked the biggest engine of conspiracy crafting what their theory was about the brand new Fire Emblem game? So naturally, I turned to the internet and asked you guys right here on YouTube what your wildest theories were for Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. So today we're going to have a little bit of fun, and I will rate your crazy Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave theories right here in this video. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who sent me their theories. It's very appreciated. And remember, none of this is personal. If your theory gets a bad grade or I poke a little bit of fun at it, it is not a personal attack on you. This is all done in good fun and in jest and does not reflect on you as an individual. So don't get mad at me in the comments. All right, let's begin with our first theory coming from Kyogre Blue, who says, I'll go with simple and boring. It's a far future sequel where Jeritza and Mercedes' descendants, open bracket, parentage unspecified, close bracket, is hunting down remnants of the Argarthans on another continent. My only theory is that the Nabatean guy we see is an artificially created being, not a proper child of the goddess. And as a supporting argument, I'm going to add this extra comment he left on my reaction video, which adds context on his take about the Divine Emperor. However, I am most curious about the Divine Sovereign. There is a lot of question and implication from his existence as a whole. The thing is that there are supposedly very few surviving Nabateans, and he is deeply unlikely to be any of the known ones. Looking at Flame, Nabateans also age very slowly, so he's fairly unlikely to be someone's descendants. But the thing that I find puzzling is his obvious blue eyes. Nabateans are all very green, different shades of green, but green nonetheless. Why make his eyes so blue? A thing to note is that we basically do have cases where quote-unquote artificial beings were made for nefarious purposes in a variety of ways. So I wonder if he may be an artificially created Nabatean. Right off the bat, I kind of really vibe with this theory, and let me explain why. First off, Dietrich seems like he's related to Jeritza or Mercedes. It's kind of hard to deny with the limited info we have. Additionally, he does have a hero's relic, Answerer, that bears the crest of Lamine, which is also the crest they both have. We can also see in the trailer that he seems to have a crest, making him a clear descendant of that line or ancestor. The idea of this taking place on another continent will be a recurring one throughout this video. We'll touch on it more later. But the architecture, environment, and presence of quite a few dark-skinned characters makes it a popular theory that I'm partial to personally. And this continent could be a place where the remains of the Argarthans have fled or are based in at this current place and time. We do see in the trailer Dietrich fighting with a priest-looking person with a gun, and this could be an indication that the person he's fighting with is an Agarthan, given we know that in Three Houses they had pretty advanced technology, busting out tactical nukes, so maybe they found a way to create firearms entirely. And we also know from the wiki that apparently they really valued technology, even back when Sothis was still around. So it's not crazy to believe whether this is prequel or sequel, the Agarthans would be pretty technologically savvy even back in the days or in the future. On the point of the Divine Sovereign, there does seem to be something off about this character if you put him in a sequel or prequel. In the prequel, why would he rule if the literal goddess Sothis, as we see in the last scene of the trailer, is still around? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And in the sequel, well, aren't all Nabateans dead? Something is kind of up with this guy. While the blue eyes might not seem like much, like Kyogre pointed out in the Three Houses world, all Nabateans we've seen in human form have green eyes, which does add to these sus allegations in my opinion. So I could see the idea that he's an artificial being of some form be true, as we've seen in Three House through Rhea and her creation of Vessel for Sothis, that there is a way to create artificial beings in the world. If this is the future and the Garthans are still around, it would make sense for them to be quite technologically advanced, as we've already discussed. And they might have found a way to do the create a whole person better than Rhea ever did, which could lend to Kyogre's theory that this guy's a big old fake. He's just impersonating a Nabatean. I do want to push this a little further, since in the trailer, Dietrich says, "It is imperative that I face it again. I must cull it with this blade." Clearly, Dietrich isn't talking about something he views as human or a person, or else he would have used the pronouns him, her, or them, logically speaking. Whatever he must face is either a beast, a piece of technology, or something he doesn't really view as human. And that is perhaps this divine sovereign, whom he maybe sees as like maybe an abomination or something like that. He's also very adamant about the fact that he needs to cull it with the blade, presumably Answer, a hero's relic, which would, if we are in a sequel to Three Houses, something that was made through the use of Nabatean bones. There could definitely be a little bit of a poetic purpose for that, as the Divine Sovereign would be viewed by Dietrich as impersonating the Nabatean, which he may very much view as sacrilegious if he's from Fodlan. I did a little bit of extrapolating from the original theory, my bad, but I do see this theory as having a lot of merit. And while it seems very, very specific, so it's probably not going to be that in the game, I do enjoy the creativity of thinking a little bit outside the box, of even going further than just prequel, sequel, looking at why certain characters are where they are. And I do appreciate the astute observation of details within the trailers themselves. I give this theory a good old 9 out of 10, Kyogre. All right, moving on to the next one, contrasting with our previous take here, we have Callum60, who says, "I think it will take place in the past, because if they set it in the future, I feel like they would have to pick a route for a canon ending. Either that, or it is set in a far future that nothing would be mentioned of Three Houses, which would be bad use of the future part of Three Houses." So I brought this up because I think this is one of the main arguments I've seen online about this having to be a prequel, given the three route nature of Three Houses. Giving it a canon ending might be seen as invalidating, like, a good chunk of the game by certain fans, so I kind of get the reticence to want a sequel in that sense. I understand where that comes from. The other point about having to set this in a far future where the events of Three Houses are never mentioned being a bad idea is quite valid in my opinion also. From a lore standpoint, you're kind of doing a disservice to your game if you set it in the same world but acting like nothing happened, especially if you set it within Fodlan. Some people have proposed keeping the detail vague enough that it could apply to any route, and I wouldn't be against that fully, but I personally think it would have to be set on a different continent or within a different nation. That way it makes narrative sense that the events of Three Houses aren't mentioned that much within the story. This kind of does feel like a cop-out though, but it is a valid concern for a lot of the Three Houses fan base. So for that, I give it a 5 out of 10. Valid concern, but there wasn't much of a theory there in general. It just, lacks detail. The next theory does add on to the prequel theory and where it comes from, thanks to Fume Knights of Chivalry. My guess is that it's a prequel, though it might also take place in Almira or another continent rather than Fodlan proper. However, the presence of Sothis and her canonical time travel just makes the time placement harder. And they would also later add, while answering someone else's comment who was saying that Sothis' presence makes it impossible to be a sequel, with the following: Sothis can travel through time, though. This doesn't really confirm things. I do think the time travel take is interesting, because it is true that in Three Houses we see Sothis use time travel. The one moment that comes to mind is when she reverses time at the start of the game to save Byleth's life. And I think in Three Houses it's more shown in short bursts through the time wheel. But there might be a few bigger moments where it happens. Three Houses fans who have a lot more experience with the game's lore and story could maybe tell me in the comments. Maybe when she was at the height of her power and not in a recovering state as she is in Three Houses, that power allowed her to have a bigger manipulation over the timeline. Maybe. It's very speculatory. I personally tend to hate time travel stories in fiction personally. It's never something I've gravitated towards, but it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for Fire Emblem, as we've seen time travel and multiverse stuff in the franchise before. So it's not crazy to think. It's not a preposterous idea. It's just one I wouldn't enjoy because I don't like that kind of stuff, I think. FeNighter Shovely also brings up Almira as a potential location, and I do like that guess. I'll explain a little later why though, as there's somebody else who's talked about Almira to more extent in their comment later in the video. I will give a 6 out of 10 for this theory. I don't think you supported your point of the prequel very well, but you did bring it up. You did also bring up an interesting element with the time travel. Even though I don't like it, it is something interesting to consider. And I do give you 1 extra point for a very cool username. You get a passing grade, my friend. Next up, we have Niels0A, or Niels Soa, I guess, who says, mid-future, other side of Almira, Sothis and Byleth are fused. They will find a cheeky way to not have to set a canon ending for Three Houses, just make Fodlan irrelevant outside of Dietrich, or Sothis nuked the entire timeline, went far, far back because all timelines end in a big catastrophe, unless a Nargarthian cell is snuffed out right there in the past. Another time travel theory. These seem to be very popular, but someone else who brings up Almira. So very similar to FeNighter Shovely earlier. But I did want to bring it up because I do find the idea of a god being nuking an entire timeline and starting all over again because some pesky nerds who don't like said god keep messing things up. It's very funny. It really does give off like college student restarting their essay all over again because they didn't like their thesis at the end of the day. But you know, with godly implications. To me, that's funny for some reason. I don't know. It's very unlikely in my opinion, but it did give me a good giggle. They also brought up the Sothis and Byleth fusing theory, which is one I've seen a few times on Reddit. So by the end of 3 houses, Byleth and Sothis are technically fused as one. Even if you don't pick the weird Sothis x Byleth option, which they really need to stop doing that in these games. Ooh. Either way, I digress. Let's get back to the theory. Their souls kind of become one regardless, which has led to a lot of people to theorize that Byleth's body with time eventually got overtaken by Sothis, as she's a god, and what is stopping a god from doing that? Well, I guess nothing. I guess nothing is stopping a god from doing that, but there's really just no real evidence to that. It's all very speculatory, but again, never impossible. I give you a 7 out of 10. It feels a little too crazy, but you get 2 extra points because I laughed, okay? I made you pass because you made me laugh. Next up, we have quite an out there theory by Grizz 4899. A crazy theory that I came up with fixes a plot point in 3 houses that I felt was dumb, with Byleth just being unconscious for the 5-year time skip. So my crazy theory is that as Byleth was falling, they accidentally triggered a huge divine pulse, sending them into the past. Then once the game is over, either Sothis, using the full power of her goddess power, is able to send Byleth back to the 3 houses timeline, or instead of it being Sothis, Byleth, probably being somewhat immortal from merging with Sothis, goes into magic hibernation, also obviously gets amnesia from as a result of either of those options. What? This isn't happening. But they did open with saying it was crazy, so I respect the self-awareness. But I doubt that the next game's whole plot is Byleth's little coma adventure. That doesn't seem right. But I respect the creativity and trying to fix problems that bothered you. 4 out of 10. Not very likely, but pretty creative. The next theory comes from Michael Hansel, who says, pretty easy theory is the game has to take place in either the future or some sort of alternate timeline. The only proof you need is Answerer's existence. If this was back when Sothis was alive, there would be no Hero's Relic. It can't take place between the massacres of the Nabateans and 3 House because the Lamine Creststone has always been in the Raphael gem, as seen when we fight the Dark Lamine with Nemesis. For the Answer to exist and use the Crest of Lamine, it must take place after 3 houses, in which case the Raphael gem was reassembled into the Answerer somehow, or a completely alternate timeline, in which case it always was Answerer. Entirely unprovable theory that I really like. I think the Divine Sovereign is either Maquil, the Windcaller, or Indech, the Immovable. We never get to see their humanoid form, and they could both easily be alive. Sothis could also have had new children if this is a sequel, but with who and how eludes me. Michael makes a good point here. While the crest could be explained in the past through blood transfusions, as those have happened in the series, mainly Yuri and Gerald as examples, it's hard to explain the crest stones and hero relics in the past. The only argument I've been able to somewhat create for this situation is that perhaps we know the Argarthans were technologically advanced, as mentioned earlier, and had clashed often with the Nabateans at this point, or at least Sothis to some extent, as we knew there was tension before the big war. Maybe some level of research had been obtained through fighting with the Nabateans, which led them to creating early versions of the weapons that were later created after the events of the Red Canyon. But even then, this feels wholly unconvincing, as the term Hero's Relic being used points to a post-war of hero time, since the term was only really in use after that because Rhea did a whole lot of rewriting of history, framing those weapons in a positive light. Either way, Michael makes some very good point concerning the potential time this could take place in. However, they seem more convinced of the alternate timeline being where this is set, which could be possible, as this has been a popular theory thrown around due to the existence of 3 Hopes. I'm not very convinced about that one, since 3 Hopes was already an alternate timeline. I don't think they'd make 2 games in the 3 House universe in a row that happen in an alternate timeline. Unless that's the shtick they're looking to create for the specific universe, where all the stories happen within a weird multiverse. I don't know, maybe that's what they're looking for. It could be an interesting concept though. Finally, the last point Michael brings up is the Divine Sovereign being Maquil or Indech. I do like this, as it's true we've never seen their humanoid form. But this would have to happen in an alternate timeline or a prequel. It couldn't happen in the 3 House world. It's unlikely, but it is a fun little theory. I will give you an 8 out of 10 for your theory. I love the use of in-universe pointable facts to support your argument. Our next theory comes from Alex Brown, And Alex says it was all a dream. Smiley face. 1 out of 10. Smiley face. Next up, we have Valvadus. I think Fortune's Weave and the Japanese name about red and purples means it will be the opposite of three houses. Instead of choosing a route, we will go from army to army, Radiant Dawn style, before all coming together. Also, it's set in Dagda in the past, but not distant past. 300 years ago, I would say. So the Japanese name for Fortune's Weave, I believe, loosely translates to a riot of color, which is in line with the different banners behind each lord being of a different color, maybe identifying different factions, as Valvadus said. Maybe they come together in the end, which is a nice little theory because it relates to Radiant Dawn, and Radiant Dawn is one of my favorite Fire Emblem games, so it appeals to me really well. The Dagda theory is an interesting one, as a few people saw the translation for the Divine Sovereign's heroic game actually be Dagsian heroic game, is what I saw on Reddit. In the Japanese trailer, this might end up being localized to Dagda later on when they, reveal it in North America, so it could very much be the case. And we also don't know much about Dagda as a location in the Three Houses world, so it could be a very easy location to craft the new story in, as the history that we have there from the previous game is very limited, so it's very easy to be able to do whatever you want with it. I like the 300 years ago theory a little less because of Sothis' presence in the trailer. It doesn't make a lot of sense since Rhea would still be trying to bring her back. For a prequel theory, in my opinion, you'd have to set yourself back before the war with the Agarthans. That seems like the only logical place to put a prequel story, especially with the appearance of Sothis. I'll give your theory a 6 out of 10. Really fun piece of information through translations were found, which I really like. Not found out of the 300 years ago prediction, and I do think that there's a better candidate setting than Dagda, which we've already talked about, but we will be focusing a little bit more on it this time with our next comment from Jason Orange GG. A bit of a basic one, but I think the game, regardless of prequels / sequel memes, is set in Almira, due to the peoples of Almira's love of battle, especially because of what Fortune's Weave main sort of setting seems to imply. The heroic games. Big arena / coliseum filled with spectators who want to be entertained by combat sport, and possibly some participant outside of the main cast so far might just be in it for the thrill of battle. A more boring reasoning for it is probably how Almira is described as having fertile prairies, desert, and mountain ranges. It just lends itself a bit better to the almost Mediterranean vibe the trailer gives off in some scenes. And I would agree with Jason. I like the setting of Almira the most, because Jason is right. The description we do have of the people of Almira are that they are a warrior folk, having games called heroic games that are basically gladiatorial games. Makes a lot of sense for people who value a battle / warrior culture. The architecture being almost Roman-esque would even link to the Mediterranean vibes the landscapes give off, which also makes sense from the few descriptions we have of Almira in the World of Three Houses. I'm also going to extrapolate a little here. We've also seen this statue in the trailer. A lot of people have brought it up, of what looks like a fighter surrounded by like the heads of the people he's killed. That could be also a sign of the warrior culture, which would keep the memories of heroes alive through statues. Side note on that statue, a few people have pointed out that this could be a statue of Nemesis with the heads of Nabatean, and I kind of see it if I like squint a bit. Jokes aside, it's an interesting theory, and if that turns out to be true, I wouldn't be surprised though, and very astute eye from those people. Another element that inspires me to say this might be set in Almira is the presence of a lot of darker skinned character in the trailer. Almirians, from what we've seen in Three Houses, tend to have a darker complexion. The appearance of Kai, Lida, and Theodora kind of lead me to believe that this might be the right setting, since they have seemingly darker skin. But I do think there's a lot of little threads of evidence that are pointing us towards that setting, and I like that setting for this game. So I'll give Jason's theory a 9 out of 10 because I believe him to be spot on. Great analysis using secondary sources from Jason. Our next theory won't be as solid, but we're going to read it nonetheless thanks to Aubrey. They say, terrible theory. Blue Lion's route is canon. After that ending, Rhea ends up making a Crest baby with Catherine, whose family line eventually ends up in Almira, where Fortune's Weave take place. The descendant we see in the game is Theodora. The proof? Theodora gives me Rhea vibes. Her name even has Rhea in it if you rearrange it. Plus, she's blonde, like Catherine. Worst theory I can think of, but you ask for hot takes, so I feel like I just read some very terrible fan fiction, but there is a silver lining here. Aubrey did admit twice it was a bad theory, and we appreciate and respect self-awareness here. So 2 out of 10 for self-awareness. And the letter rearrangement made me laugh, but it still feels like a little bit of a stretch. I would have given you a 3 out of 10 because you made me laugh, but Rhea and Catherine don't even have a support in 3 houses. So I have to dock a point for that because you didn't research properly. Next up, we have Stylish with a theory we've already seen, but I felt it needed highlighting. They say, my theory is that this game will not be like 3 houses in that you split off in separate routes. I think instead it's going to be the opposite, where a certain number of faction, likely 4 characters shown in the trailer, that end up joining together by the end of the game. Weaving together, if you will. First off, that play on word was amazing. I love play on words, so you're getting free points on that one. And yes, the 4 faction coming together theory was already said, but I do get another opportunity to glaze Radiant Dawn, so I will. 10 out of 10. Yes, this is pure favoritism towards Stylish since he made a funny. Next up, we have Steven Showa. My idea is that it's a prequel showcasing the birth of those who slither in the dark. I do like the idea of a prequel showcasing the fight between the Garthans and the Nabatean that led to Sothis going to sleep. That does sound like a fun period of history to explore in 3 houses. Seeing how all that came about and getting more lore from that time period is something that is appealing to me. I'll give you a 5 out of 10 because the setting is fun, but you did not use any evidence to support your claim. But you must support your arguments with evidence from the text or trailer in this case, okay? It's very important in this class, y'all. Next up, we have LoveShard, who says, honestly, so many, referring to the amount of theories, but I think one of my favorite has nothing to do with sequel/prequel. I think my favorite theories are 1, the Sovereign isn't a pure Nabatean because of his blue eyes. And the second one, the glasses girl with Kai is actually an avatar, since she is the only character we see that has no voice lines in the trailer and is shown twice, but nothing is said about them. Like, it's just weird. Why show them? Kai did not need them around to be showcased. So on LoveShard's first point, we did talk about the Divine Sovereign being a fake, but another theory for the blue eyes is that he might be a half Nabatean, since technically there are routes in 3 houses where Flame, Rhea, and Sethith are still around after the events of the game. And one could argue that perhaps Byleth might be able to pass that gene on, maybe. I'm not sure how that works. I'm not exactly up to date on my magic dragon science, unfortunately, so I don't know how that works, but maybe. So it could be in the future, and this could be a descendant of some combination of characters. Perhaps. That wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility. As of the second point, it is true that the girl with the glass in the trailer is somewhat featured with no info surrounding her and could be an avatar character. And it's true that Kai did not need her around to be showcased in a proper manner. But I think the general consensus of the Fire Emblem community is that people are tired of avatar characters. We don't like them anymore. They're out. They're very 2016. They're out. So 6 out of 10. Creative idea, but I think we all want to move on from Avatar. Next theory comes from Majin Matt Plays. It's unlikely to be either. It can't be a prequel because the relics exist and crests exist, especially the crest of the Apostle like Aubrey, which didn't come to be until well after Nemesis's time. Meanwhile, I don't think it's a sequel, or at least not one set within the currently known lore of 3 houses, because crests were already fading by the time 3 houses came about, and Rhea sure as heck wouldn't let some pompous lizard call himself the Divine Monarch anywhere in ICBM range of Fodlan. So my wager is that it's an alternate timeline, or there's some really screwy lore we don't know yet. One theory I did like was that it could have been the sequel to 3 Hopes rather than 3 Houses, but even then the same problems persist. It just cannot take place in relative time frames of 3 houses with what we know. If that changes, cool, but from what we have already, it's an AU, not a quell. Majin comes in with major contrarian energy by shitting on both sequel and prequel theories, with honestly really good points. We've been over the relics not making a lot of sense in a prequel set in a time before Sothis would still be around, since those two things kind of clash against one another. The crest of Aubrey is an interesting one, though. It is true that we only hear of Aubrey in the year 185 of 3 Houses' world, well after the War of Heroes, which is where Serios killed Nemesis. There's no evidence within 3 Houses' lore that Aubrey was around before. However, there's nothing that says that him and the 4 apostles weren't either. It's very unlikely that the apostles were Nabatean, as every single piece of lore within 3 houses says that there were only Seros and the 4 saints left after the Red Canyon, but we also know the apostle had crest blood, as their blood was seen as special for the rite of resurrection, where they attempt to bring Sothis back. And for the next part of this, I'd like to thank my viewer Chipino, who made a document that does make some pretty good points about Aubrey here. Aubrey is known by Sethith, as confirmed by Yuri and Sethith's support in 3 Hopes. He even calls him an old friend. We also know that Sethith, after the War of Heroes, remained in Xanadu to look over Flame until he was called to Garreg Mach in the year 1159. Aubin was around Garrett Mach almost 1,000 years before when they did the Rite of Resurrection, and then went into exile in the Abyss. So it's very much unlikely that they would have crossed paths unless they did so before the War of Heroes. We also know that Aubin was around long enough to give his blood to Yuri, passing his crest to him. So with all that, it can be surmised that Aubin had some sort of power that allowed him to live like a long time. That doesn't really explain the fact that his crest is on Kai though, which I agree. But some people have theorized that if it's a prequel, it might mean that Aubin and Kai are the same person. I'm not 100% convinced by that point, but we do see it in the trailer that Kai seems to have some sort of magical power that could be a hint of something more. That theory is a little crazy to me, but it works technically. But to get back to Majin's point, there are elements in the trailer that seem to contradict both theories, which point to an alternate universe. That would allow the writers to get away with pretty much doing whatever they want with the lore. The Three Hopes sequel theory, while on paper can fix some issues, I don't love it because it somehow invalidates the story of Three Houses in my opinion. Three Hopes is a nice side game, but it's not a mainline Fire Emblem, so potentially it was skipped by a lot of people, and most people might remember more elements of the plot of Three Houses and get very confused by playing this game if the plot follows the one of a side game that's not even set in the same exact universe. That gets very confusing and could alienate some players. But overall, you get an 8 out of 10 on the alternate universe theory because it makes sense, even though I'm not a fan of alternate universes usually. Next up is the most logical take so far, I think, with Dark Umbreon, who says, I love reading all these theories backed up by our knowledge of the timelines and lore. But there's one thing I see a lot of people overlooking. It could just be poorly written and completely discount the existing lore. This is intelligent systems after all. And this is the most level-headed Fire Emblem fan in the world. Because yeah, he's kind of right. We are definitely overanalyzing this. And maybe IS simply just messed up with the lore, man. It wouldn't be the first time in the history of written fiction that someone messed up their own lore. That happens literally all the time. I had to fit this one in there because it made me laugh. 9 out of 10 for Dark Umbreon. And our final theory of the video to end on a positive note by Discord Now, who says, my wild theory is that this is going to be the best game in the series. We'll have great gameplay, an amazing cast of character. We'll finally have a good story in modern Fire Emblem game. While I don't necessarily agree with the part that says finally have a good story in modern FE part, I will say that I do love the positivity you are bringing, my friend. And we as a community need more positivity. So thank you for that. You get a free 9 out of 10. This was the last theory for this video, but I do wanted to point you guys to the document made by Chipino I referenced a few times in this video. It will be linked in the description of this video, as it does make some really good argument in the favor of a prequel. So I'll let you all be the judge of that. So thank you once again to him for making all this work happen. He did want me to say one thing in exchange of using the document for the video, and that is the following. The Garcia and Gilliam romance is the best romance in all of Fire Emblem. Sure, why not? Jokes aside, I do want to say I had a blast making this video. It felt like a dialogue instead of me rambling, which was a nice change of pace. Thank you to everyone who shared their theories, even if I did not use yours in the making of this video. Thank you for participating. All of this was in good fun and in jest, and just as a way to theorize while we wait for the next piece of information about Fortune's Weave. So if I gave you a bad grade, do not take it personally. It was more in the purpose of having fun and making jokes. The grading system wasn't that serious after all. I also had a poll running on my channel asking people if this game would be a sequel or a prequel, and at the time of recording, this poll is at 1.9k votes, with 58% in favor of a sequel. I know it's not a huge set of data to base a conclusion on, but it seems like the general pulse of the community is leading in the favor of a sequel. With all that being said, feel free to leave your wildest Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave theory in the comment, and if we get enough good submissions, I might do a part 2 to this video. And please hit the subscribe button, as this will be the channel to follow for any news and update concerning Fire Emblem's Fortune's Weave, as I will be covering it all the way up to its release and even after. Thank you all for watching. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. I need to give a huge shout out to all my YouTube members and Twitch subscribers who support this channel. And a huge special shout out goes to my tier 2 and 3 member here on YouTube, those being Brawler456, Forgotten Fox, Hirame, Case, Iron Wolf, No, Storm Eagle CH, Stylish, A Grumpy Bear, Replord 0, and Gotonic 3. That's enough for me today. Hopefully you guys like this video. See you all in the next one. Bye-bye.